Hello class, this is the tutorial for the Excel portion of problem set 3, and this problem set is going to be due on Friday, April 18th, and you'll be submitting it on bblearn. Like I mentioned in class, you can do this exercise in a group of 2 or 3 if you'd like, or you can do it individually. Just make sure to be really specific when you submit it. One person will submit it from your group, and they'll put the different group members' names in the notes section, and then that will also carry over to the quiz. So one person will take the quiz, and then we'll apply that grade to the other group members. And then for those of you that are not submitting it, just indicate in the notes section who submitted the work for you. And again, this is not meant to be something where you partition out the work, but where you work on it together collaboratively, and so you can kind of discuss the questions that are asked and work on the information together. So there's going to be 3 parts here. We've got the straightened transition model, and you're going to be doing some of your own research on the sagebrush juniper ecosystem, and coming up with 3 different pieces to the state and transition model, and that's on this first tab. So open up the Excel spreadsheet, and then you'll just type the information in here. And so life form is going to be something like a grass, forb, shrub, that kind of thing, and then some major species that are in there, whether it's juniper or sagebrush or something like that, and then finding out what kind of disturbances are common in this ecosystem and putting all that information in here. So then the second part is what we'll kind of go through today, and this is the calculating diversity, which is something that we've hopefully you're pretty familiar with now, and we'll be doing it on a larger scale though, and we'll be using a couple different other features in Excel. So we've gone, in this little scenario, we've gone out and used some quadrats to sample some areas across a landscape in a healthy sagebrush juniper ecosystem. And so we want to know some information about that ecosystem and about these 5 different stands that we've sampled in. So on tab 2, diversity, the first thing we need to do is kind of take care of some organizational things here. So I would like to always be able to see what stand I'm looking at and the title bar here. And so I'm going to use what's called freezing panes. And you can freeze panes a couple different ways. Got your view tab here. You can either freeze panes by freezing the top row or freezing the first column, but I want to actually freeze both the top row and the first column. And so I put my cursor right here on the corner, and it freezes both directions. And so I've selected that. So now when I scroll over, I can always see which group I'm in, and I can always see the top bar. And if I wanted, you can always move this bigger as well, which is kind of a nice feature for other things. So if you had other things to look at, you could freeze it anywhere you'd like to, just as an example. But I'm gonna move it back over here. All right, the second thing I want to do is I want to make sure I have a distinct visual for where there's the break in these different stands. And so I'm just going to highlight this whole row, and I am going to put an underline under this whole row. You could also highlight it and change its color, whatever you want to do to make sure that you can easily see where one stand ends and the other begins. And this will come in handy as we do our calculations. And I've altered this this data set slightly just for this example, just so you know if you get a little bit different numbers, that's why. Okay. Now I'm going to create 3 columns. These are the columns that I'm going to want to do some calculations on. So the first one is the proportion, so PI. The second is D for diversity, and the third is H. Now we're going to be calculating D here, and then from this calculation of D, we could calculate any of the metrics that we talked about, with whether it's just plain D or whether it's 1 minus D or 1 divided by D. And so we would then do that calculation later. So first of all, for proportion, we want to have the number, the canopy cover for each species divided by the total canopy cover. And since I don't want to make an extra column for the sum, I'm just going to do that calculation here. And I'm going to highlight this whole stand, close my parentheses, and enter. Now, I can't just drag this down because it would also move this box here. So if you remember, we will use our numbers sign, our money sign, to have that stationary. And so let's drag this down a little bit and make sure that it's staying in the right spot. Yep, so it's using this current number divided by the sum of all those numbers for the stand. So I'm going to drag this down for this entire stand. And then I'm going to go scroll down. And these look like zeros because we've got our significant digits moved that way, which is fine for now. And yours might not look like just like that, which is okay. So for this next stand, I'm just going to drag this one in and notice that this box is in the wrong place. It's looking at stand 1. So I have two options here. One, I can just go through and highlight this and delete it, and then it's going to give me the option or some prompting to select. And so then I'll drag down all the way to stand 2, which now you can see why having these lines is really useful. I'll go back up and press enter and make sure that that's in the right place, and it is. And so I'll put my money sign in again, press enter, and then I'm going to drag this down just like I did before. The other option you have for changing that equation for this next stand is to, and actually this is a little, I think I do want to be able to see the significant digits. So we'll have those show up. So for this next one, I'm going to drag this down here again. And instead of deleting this, I'm actually just going to grab this box and I'm going to drag it down. And it's going to be maybe a little bit of a different size, like you see. And it's a little bit problematic because it kind of moves around a little bit on you. But I'll drag this box up. And then I'm going to shrink this to make sure that it fits in the right area. So now it's in the right area. I press enter. And I'll double click and make sure that it worked. Okay. So now I don't have to do my money signs again. I'll drag this down. And looking at stand 4. And again, I'll drag this into place and make it fit. Enter. And then drag this down for all of stand 4. One thing that you'll learn in working with Excel is that there's usually many ways to do the same thing, and so you might find your own technique for doing some of these things, which is just fine as long as you're accomplishing the same objective. So let's make sure that we have all of our species covered here. Goes over a little bit, which really wouldn't make a difference, but we'll just make it fit nicely. Now when you get to the end here, you can just double click on this and it goes down to the end of the information. So now we've calculated the proportion for each of these. And so we want to do D. And now D is the proportion squared. So this one is nice and simple. We just equal the proportion and square it. And that's our D. And for this one, it's going to be the same all the way down, since we've already calculated our proportion. So we can just double click on this black cross there, and it goes all the way down to the bottom. And I don't need that many numbers. And if you find yourself with like a big space like this, you can just get the cursor here along the edge and double click and it'll shrink it up a little bit. And then for h, now if you remember, h is the negative sum of the proportion times the natural log of the proportion. But because later on when we get to the next step it's difficult to add a negative sum, I'm just going to make this number negative for right now, and then we'll or this equation negative, and which will end up creating a positive value. So this is going to be the negative proportion times the natural log of the proportion. And then we get a positive number. And so that negative sign can be applied anywhere along that process as long as you end up with a positive number. And again, get my black cross here, and I'm going to double click, and it'll go all the way down to the bottom and have all this calculated. So that was really easy, but we have some pretty important information we still need from this. Although we have the D and the H for each individual species, we need to know what those are in terms of a sum so we can actually understand what our diversity is for that stand. And to do this, we're going to use something called a pivot table. And pivot tables are really useful pieces of, or a really useful tool that Excel has to summarize large amounts of data, which you'll inevitably be working with. So first I'm going to put my cursor up here on K2, and I'm going to go into Insert, and I'm going to select Pivot Table. And on older versions of Excel, it's in the Insert area somewhere. You might have to use the Help function in Excel to find it, which is okay. And there's also lots of video tutorials on YouTube of how to use pivot tables. A lot of these different tools that I'm teaching how to use, if you might forget what they are or what they're called, but you can always look them up again. The Excel help is very good. So click Pivot Table. No, I don't want to change my color performance. And my table range is going to be the columns that I have, so I'm going to select all these columns. And I click this little red arrow here. And I'm going to want it in an existing worksheet, and I've already clicked the location. It already has recognized that as K2. I could also do it on a new tab if I wanted to, but for now I'm just going to leave it where it is. Click OK. So then you get this this dialog function over here, and notice you need to scroll over, and this is the empty pivot table. Now what's happening is this pivot table is seeing that you have several columns with different labels, and it's going to give you some options of how to summarize that information. So I'm going to want to look at the stand, and I want to look at, I don't need to look at my proportion because every proportion is going to add up to 1, but I want to look at my D and my H. And I'm going to drag these over to the values. So right now, I also want to look at my species, because that's going to give me a count. I'm going to drag this over. So right now I have a count of species, a count of D, and a count of H. And all of these are going to be the same because the count is the same. But I want the count of species so that I know what my species richness is. And then I want a count of, for these ones I actually want a sum. And so that sum is going to give me my value for D. So if you notice there, I clicked the drop-down arrow, I clicked Value Field Settings, and selected Sum. So now these are the values for your diversity. They're already calculated, they're right here. Now the funny thing with these pivot tables is that you can't do a whole lot with the information if it's in a pivot table. So you need to copy it out. So I wouldn't be able to change the names of these columns or anything. So I'm going to copy it out, and I'm going to paste it right here. So now I can actually work with this information. So I'm going to start to change these labels here. This is the stand. This is the species richness. This is D, and this is H. Now, D, if you recall from lecture, is varied from 0 to 1, closer to 0 meaning more diverse. But I would actually like to use the indice that I indicated was more likely to be used, which is 1 divided by d. And the specific name in terms of Shannon index or diversity, or the Simpson index of diversity, those names aren't distinguishable. It's better just to refer to 1 divided by d, or just plain d. So, but in order to make this true, I need to take this information and say equals 1 divided by. And I'll do that again here. 1 divided by that number equals 1 divided by equals 1 divided by 1 divided by. Good. And now that I've done that calculation, I actually want to remove some of my significant digits here. So I'm going to highlight those and take those back to 2. So this information, let's look at our homework. So we've already calculated species richness, and we've done these calculations, and now we can graph our evenness. So to create this graph of species evenness, we are going to go back to our longer list of data here, and instead of like 5 species where you can pretty easily categorize them into most or least proportion in the whole stand, this is a little bit more complicated, and so we want to make sure that our information is sorted properly. And we wouldn't just be able to sort this proportion column, because then it would mix up all of the different stands, which wouldn't be what we needed either. So we're going to go to Sort and Filter, and we're going to select Custom Sort. And this little box will come up and it'll say, it's going to tell you that when it does sort, it's going to sort all the columns together, which is exactly what you want it to do. You want the information in row 7 to stay with row 7, and so expanding that selection is always what you select there. And the first criteria for sorting is by stand. I want stand to continually be organized from smallest to largest. And I'm going to add a level, and then I'm going to say that I also want proportion to be sorted from smallest to largest. And click OK. So now it's smallest to largest, and actually I should have selected largest to smallest for here, because I want the largest to be first. So now we have, for each stand, we have the largest to smallest proportion, which will allow us to do an accurate species evenness graph. So I'm going to first select the proportion for stand 1. Highlight this whole column, and I'm going to insert a line graph. And this looks about right for what that stand is. You can see roughly that there are 30 species, and you can see the slope here. Now I want to add a line in this graph for each of the different stands. So I'm going to right-click on this table, and I'm going to choose Select Data. And I'm going to click Add. And when I do that, I get this little box, and it allows me to pick a name, which I'm actually not going to do for right now, but I'm going to pick a series value. Sometimes I get mixed up and I pick my series values for my name. Gives you funny results, and then I usually know what I've done wrong. So again, now you can see the real benefit that we've done with making these lines here. It's very useful to have them. Click OK. And I'm going to add another one. And again, doing the series values. And I'm going to select the information for stand 3. And click OK. And add another one. And series values. Scroll down to highlight all of stand 4. Click OK. And add one more. series values. Highlight all those. Click OK. Now while I'm here, well, I could change those names. I'll change them in a little bit. So click OK. Let's look at our graph. So now we have all of these species evenness graphed here. It's a little bit difficult to see how long they are, but you can see that there's some variation in the length of these. And if you remember, the length on these this rank abundance diagram is going to be an indicator of your species richness, but so is the number. But this graph isn't quite done. We need some labels, and so we can say this is the species evenness. And I also want to add a legend. So I'm going to add a chart element over here, and this is going to be a legend, and we'll add it to the left. And I'm going to go back into here. I guess I should have added this name. So you can change this name to stand 1. Stand 2. You would save time, I suppose, by doing this initially, but here we are. Stand 3. Stand 4. Stand 5. Okay. And click OK. And that looks good. So we'll leave it at that for now, and this is what you can use to interpret some questions that you might get on species evenness. So let's look back again at our assignment. So now for this portion of calculating diversity, we've completed these steps. We've done all these 4 things, so you can check all those off. Let's move to chronosequencing, which I'll just describe a little bit for you. When we have these 5 stands, and we'd like to know what order these stands occur in terms of succession. Which stand is further along in succession, which stand is just starting out in the succession pathway. And to do that, we need a couple of pieces of information. We need to know, for this assignment, we're just going to be looking at the species that have a greater than 5% cover. And so we need to know in these stands which species have a greater than 5% cover, and not including the invasive species. And once we know that, then for those species that fit into that classification, we've given you some additional information here, more than just what's on the spreadsheet. And from this information, you can compare that to this table about what are the general characteristics that are exhibited in early stages and late stages for succession. So let's look again at our spreadsheet. Now, like I said, we need to know for each stand what species occur in that stand that are native, that have greater than 5% cover. And so in this stand, you can see that there are 2 species that have greater than 5% cover. And so for these 2 species, you would look at the description here. There's one. And here's the second one. Now again, I use Alt-Tab to switch back and forth between screens so quickly if you were curious. And so I would looking at the characteristics, I would say that Juniper occidentalis, so it's a shrub timber, medium to high tolerant of shade, and a low net priming productivity. And I would look down here, and I would see that knowing that it's timber, that it has a large biomass, that indicates that it's later stage. Its physiognomy is complex, that also indicates that it's later stage. And going down on each of these things, if that species continues to be classified as later stage, then I know that it is a later cereal stage species. And if it takes up a high portion of that stand, then that stand could reasonably be assumed to be a later succession stand. So this is a relatively simple one, this first stand. I'm going to close this. But if we scroll down, things get a little more complicated. A little more species in here, so you'll have to look up each of these species information. But all those are natives, those all look good. Down here again, we've got maybe one that's dominant, but a little less dominant than the first stand we looked at. And then we would look specifically at these species for this stand, and kind of looking at what proportion they take up and what their life history traits are. And then we have this stand here that has, again, two species that are dominant that fit into that greater than 5% category. So once you have developed somewhat of an idea of what order they should go in, and you can kind of take notes and whatever you'd like to do in this chronosequence tab on that information, and then once you have that a little bit finalized, you can put those numbers in here on what order you believe those stands occur in terms of early, mid, and climax species or cereal stages there. When you have completed the exercise, then you will save your Excel spreadsheet and submit that on to BBLearn. And then you will complete the quiz that's also that's associated with that information. That'll be available soon. And there'll be some additional questions on that quiz related to material that we've been covering recently in class. So make sure that you have some of the information available at your disposal to reference for that quiz. And do a thorough discussion on any question that asks for a discussion, and ask questions of your classmates or of the TAs or myself if you have any problems with this exercise.